Dead by Daylight has never had the best reputation when it comes to metas, whether it be the old school survivor meta of stacking multiple second chance perks to punish the killer no matter what they do, or the half a decade long ruin meta, or the short-lived machine gun build. It seems that no matter what ends up being meta, people just end up hating it. While all of the infamous metas fall into various degrees of frustrating, one of them stands out from the rest, not for being overpowered, but for being unbelievably, mind-numbingly boring. A meta that sucked the fun out of the game so badly that one of DBD's biggest YouTubers made a song about it, and the devs straight up added new mechanics into the game specifically to stop a meta like this from happening ever again. Ever since the release of the Hag back in December of 2016, the meta for killer builds in DBD has practically always been generator slowdown. It was slowdown 8 years ago when Ruin first released, it's still slowdown to this day, and it was slowdown at all times in between. Of course, it has varied as to which slowdown perks are meta, whether it's Ruin, Pop, Corrupt, Pain Rares, etc, but for the most part, if it's not slowing gens, it's not worth using. Although every killer meta effectively did the same thing of slowing gens, each different perk had its own method of getting value, with reworked Ruin getting value from high mobility and map presence scaring survivors off gens, or Surge proccing off basic attack downs, and Pain Res proccing off Scourge hooks. Generally speaking, killer players preferred slowdown perks that would passively earn their value, without needing to go out of their way to do something in order to manually trigger it, as any time spent doing that extra thing is time spent not chasing a survivor. This meant that whenever viable, people would gravitate towards something like Ruin, as the value comes from the killer just showing up, opposed to something like Pentimento or gen kicking perks, as the time spent interacting with totems and or kicking gens takes away from chase time, which somewhat offsets the value if you're also slowing your progress to slow the enemy's progress. And this passive value is something that the devs weren't a fan of. All the way back when Ruin was first reworked, they mentioned in one of their developer update posts that they want slowdown perks to be more proactive than passive, stating that original Ruin had a huge amount of potential with very little effort or risk from the killer, which was likely the same thought process that caused Ruin and Corrupt to lose a lot of their strength compared to their release versions. But only time would tell if the devs' philosophy would prove healthy or unhealthy for the game. And Judgment Day would soon arrive on the 19th of July 2022 in patch 6.1.0, where behavior would finalize their push away from passive slowdown perks, instead buffing various more proactive perks, effectively creating an artificial meta. If you keep up to date with other online PvP games, then you may have heard this term a few times before, but many DBD players might not know what this means. In a regular meta, players find a strategy of their own accord that best utilizes certain game mechanics, characters, playstyles, etc. in order to maximize their chances of winning. While this can include overpowered characters, perks, etc., think Release Spirit, metas stem from the developers trying their best to create a fair and balanced experience. Artificial metas, however, instead stem from the developers effectively putting their foot down and saying, no, I don't want you to use those perks, you have to use these instead. What this brute force usually results in is the old meta being gutted to the point of being unusable, and the new meta not just being strong, but being either far too overpowered, frustrating, or rather unintuitive to use. Players can absolutely feel the difference between a natural meta and an artificial meta, and Behavior had just created one hell of an artificial meta, being the gen kicking meta, otherwise known as the Overbrine meta. All within the same patch, 6.1.0, Behavior completely gutted the previous meta perks and gave their new favourites some huge buffs. Hex Ruin. Nerf. Regression speed completely halved from 200% to 100%. Nerf. Now automatically disables itself if a survivor is killed. So the main meta perk would now only get half of its old value while automatically disabling itself once a survivor dies, while still being able to get cleansed by survivors to disable it early. Corrupt Intervention. Nerf. Now automatically disables itself if a survivor is downed, which meant one of the other most popular slowdown perks would also now get rid of itself if you made the grave mistake of doing well. Two absolutely huge nerfs to the most prevalent old meta perks, now to be replaced with Generator Kicking. Buff. Sped up the gen kick animation from 2 seconds to 1.8 seconds. Buff. Kicking a gen immediately regresses it by 2.5%. Overcharge buff now grants bonus regression speed on kicked gens, starting off 25% slower than normal, gradually ramping up to 200% faster than normal over the course of 30 seconds. Eruption buff increased the regression amount from 6% to 10%. Buff increased the incapacitated effect from 16 seconds to 25 seconds. And as I'm sure you can tell, this is a clear message being sent here. No more passive slowdown, you will kick those gens. Of course, by hitting the old ones so hard, killers had no choice but to make the switch to the gen kicking perks. But with how hefty these buffs are, players would have been crazy not to switch even if the old ones went untouched. So players equipped their overcharge and eruption as they were very clearly meant to do. But there was also a third head of the gen kicking Cerberus, Call of Brine, which also regressed kick gens at 200% speed just like overcharge, but with 2 pros and 2 cons when compared to it. The first pro is that the gen will regress from 200% speed the moment you kick it instead of starting off slower than normal and ramping up over 30 seconds like overcharge. The second is that once a gen is affected by Brine, the killer will get an alert every time a survivor hits a skill check on said gen, which is some really nice information. The 2 downsides are that there's no hard skill check like overcharge, and, more importantly, Brine will only last for 60 seconds. Once that time is up, the gen automatically reverts to the regular regression speed, whereas overcharge will keep regressing at 200% indefinitely. Of course, it's stacked with overcharge, so if you're kicking the gen anyway, might as well make it regress even faster, right? And kick gens they most certainly did. Anytime killers came across a generator with even a smidge of progress, they'd of course kick it, even if it was only 1% progress, to mark it with eruption in case anybody works on it further by the time the killer gets his next down. At first, everyone was actually surprisingly happy with this new meta. Killers were happy that their slowdown perks wouldn't stop working halfway through a match like Ruin and Corrupt, and survivors were happy that killers were so hell-bent on kicking gens that any time a killer stumbled across them working on a gen, which is how a lot of chases start, the survivor would get a head start completely for free. While the killer was busy kicking the gen, survivors had the opportunity to get themselves into position near a pallet so they can start the chase not out of position, or, more prominently, survivors would just go for distance. But again, that was at first. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Matter of fact, people were already more sick of this meta after just a few months than the passive slowdown meta after years. Why? For one of the very same reasons it was nice at first. Killers need slowdown. It's no secret, and if the only viable slowdown perks require the killers to go out of their way to activate it, then they're going to go out of their way to activate it. So when stumbling across a survivor working on a gen, they were presented with 2 choices: chase the survivor or kick the gen. Chasing the survivor leaves the gen vulnerable to being repaired by a different survivor while you're preoccupied. But kicking the gen gives the survivor a big head start, which means any ensuing chase is going to take even longer than normal, which then gives the other survivors even more time to work on other gens uninterrupted. So instead of engaging in a chase where the killer is already at a big disadvantage before it's even started, they just didn't. The killer would simply kick the gen and disregard the survivor who was originally working on it, since they would now be miles away, instead opting to patrol to another gen and kick that too, only taking chases with survivors who were out of position. Killers being forced to play so defensively ended up causing so much frustration and boredom for both sides. The fun in DBD comes from chases, so when the killers are heavily disincentivized to chase anyone, nobody gets to have fun. But if the killers chose not to prioritize the gens and actually chase people, then the gens flew by in just a few minutes, and the match would be over before the killer had much of a chance to do anything. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either heavily refrain from chasing, or commit to a chase and be sent back into the queue in about 5 minutes. So, they kicked the gens. Again and again and again. And what playstyle thrives on repeatedly kicking gens? That's right, the 3-gen lockdown, everyone's favourite playstyle. With this build, 3-gen lockdowns were the strongest they had ever been, and with how defensively killers would have to play, this actually ended up happening more often than before, even from killers who weren't intentionally trying to secure a 3-gen lockdown. But many people were intentionally playing for lockdowns, and there was one killer who was already amazing at this, with this new meta only making her even more of a nightmare: the Skull Merchant. During the time of the Overbrine meta, the Skull Merchant still hadn't had her massive drone overhaul, so this was prime 3-gen Scully era. Her 3-gen lockdown potential was so nuts that even after Overcharge, Brine and Eruption had been nerfed, she was capable of holding down some of the best survivors in the world for nearly a whole hour, shown off in a video by Hens, link in the description below. So imagine how brutal it was while the gen kicking meta was in full force. The community was bored and frustrated, and eventually one of DBD's biggest creators, JRM, dropped this.
Drops cheese, hexagen, hits me, runs away, drops cheese, hexagen, hits me, runs away, drops a gen, hexagen, hits a gen, drops a cheese, hexagen.
I need fucking more, I need more pressure. Need fucking more, I need more. All the pain, I need fucking more, I need more regression. I need more, I need more. It will drive me insane. Killer drops cheese, hexagen, hits me, runs away, drops cheese, hexagen, hits me, runs away. People giving up, but I don't really care. It's never gonna work when people don't repair.
And aside from it actually being a really good song, it was just highlighting how frustrating that meta was and how ridiculous it was that killers were now more concerned about protecting their gens than actually, you know, being killers. Things needed to change. So 9 months later, on the 18th of April 2023, in patch 6.7.0, the gen kicking trio received some nerfs. Overcharge, nerf. Maximum regression speed reduced from 200% to 130%. Nerf. Reduced the missed skill check penalty from 5% to 4%. Buff. Starting regression speed increased from 75% to 85%. Eruption, nerf. Incapacitation effect completely removed. Instead, now reveals the survivor's aura for 12 seconds. Call of Brine, nerf. Regression speed reduced from 200% to 125%. And with that, the artificial meta of gen kicking was over, marking the end of Overbrine. Not long after, Grim Embrace received a buff and people quickly shifted to using Pain Res, Grim Embrace and Dead Man's Switch for their gen slowdown, which didn't seem to evoke such an intense reaction from the player base. Not long after, the Skull Merchant received a rework to her drones which severely dampened their ability to protect gens, but behaviour wasn't done yet. 10 months after the nerf of Overbrine, they added a whole new game mechanic to ensure that these hour-long gen lockdown matches never happen again. On the 30th of January 2024, in patch 7.5.0, they added the following changes to generators. Kicking a gen now regresses it instantly by 5% instead of 2.5%. Each gen can only be regressed by any means a maximum of 8 times per match. Survivors can no longer gen tap to bypass gen regression perks. Or in summary, they literally added a limit to gen kicking so that it's not possible for a meta like this to happen ever again.